Hi everyone, welcome back to Ways of the World, a brief global history with sources. We're going to look at ways of working and comparing colonial economies as we look at colonial encounters in Asia, Africa, and Oceania. So let's look at economies of coercion, forced labor, and the power of the state. Many colonial states demanded unpaid labor on public projects, and some of the worst abuses were in the Congo Free State. It was personally governed by King Leopold II of Belgium, and he facilitated a reign of terror that killed millions with his labor demands. Forced labor caused widespread starvation as people couldn't grow their own crops. And Belgium finally stepped in and took control of the Congo in 1908 to stop those abuses. Here's the cultivation system of the Netherlands, East Indies, now known as Indonesia. Peasants had to devote at least 20% of their land to cash crops to pay as taxes. And the proceeds were sold for high profits, and that financed Dutch industrialization. It enriched the traditional authorities who reinforced the system, and it led to a wave of deadly famines in Java. Many areas resisted the forced cultivation of cash crops. For example, German East Africa, there was a major rebellion in 1905 against forced cotton cultivation. Okay, let's look at colonial violence in the Congo. Horrific photos of mutilated children had an important impact on public opinion about imperial rule in the Congo Free State. It came to symbolize widespread abuses like murder, rape, starvation, and the burning of villages. This is all associated with efforts to obtain supplies of wild rubber for use in industrialized societies. So how could political and social reformers in the 19th century use photographs like this to promote changes in how governments ruled their colonies? This photograph shows children mutilated in the Congo Free State, likely for not having reached some production quota. Photos like this could and did elicit public support for better treatment of the natives and ultimately led to the Belgian state assuming control of the colony in 1908 from Leopold II. Economies of cash crop agriculture, the pull of the market. Many people were happy to increase production for world markets, and there's considerable profit to small farmers in areas like the Irrawaddy Delta. In the Mekong Delta of French-ruled Vietnam, rice cultivation resulted in significant environmental damage to local fish and shellfish, and the food sources and produced methane gas, contributing to global warming. In the southern Gold Coast, which is now known as Ghana, African farmers took the initiative to develop export agriculture, they became the leading supplier of cocoa in 1911, but labor shortages led to exploitation of former slaves and men marrying women for their labor power, an influx of migrants that created tensions, and many colonies specialized in one or two cash crops, and that created a dependence on their European counterparts. Economics of wage labor, migration for work. Wage labor in European enterprises was common, both from colonized regions and from China and Japan. African migrants moved in several directions. The Atlantic slave trade continued for much of the 19th century, and internal migration grew from European empires. Europeans took huge tracts of African land and employed Africans as workers. The gold and diamond mines of South Africa provided employment, however, they worked in harsh conditions. In Asia, some 29 million Indians and 19 million Chinese migrated. They worked on plantations financed from Europe, and they also experienced harsh working conditions and high death rates. The British facilitated migration of Indian labor to far-flung territories of their empire, especially after the end of the slave trade. And mines were another source of wage labor, but very dangerous work. Chinese migrants also settled in Manchuria, and they participated in the gold rushes of Australia and California. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States all limited their Chinese immigration in the late 19th century. Colonial cities attracted many workers. They were seen as centers of opportunity, but they were segregated, unsanitary, and overcrowded. And that created a place for a native, Western-educated middle class. And it also created an enormous class of urban poor that could barely live and couldn't raise families. Economic change in the colonial world. These workers on a Ceylon tea plantation in the early 20th century are moving sacks of tea into a drying house in preparation for export. The Lipton label on the bags is a reminder of the role of large-scale foreign investment in the economic transformations of the colonial era. So using evidence from the image, explain how imperialism changed traditional crop cultivation. The image demonstrates that colonial subjects shifted away from their typical crops, likely foodstuffs, to those products destined for export. In this case, the product is tea. What kinds of wage labor were available in the colonies? Why might people have taken part in them? How did doing so change their lives? Well, members of the colonial societies could find paid work in European-owned plantations and mines, on construction projects, or as household servants. And their participation was driven by the need for money, by the loss of land adequate to support their families, or sometimes by the orders of colonial authorities. And their lives became dependent on wages that were low and earned through hard and often dangerous labor. Many colonial workers settled in overcrowded cities where, because of the cost of living, normal family life was virtually impossible for many wage laborers. All right, women in the colonial economy. Examples from Africa. In pre-colonial Africa, women were usually active farmers, and they had some economic autonomy. But in the colonial era, women's lives diverged even more from men. Men tended to dominate the lucrative export crops, and women were left with almost all of the subsistence work. Large numbers of men, sometimes a majority of the population, migrated to work elsewhere, and women were left at home to cope, including supplying food to men in the cities. But women coped in a variety of ways, and the colonial economy also provided some opportunities to women. Especially small trade and marketing, sometimes women's crops came to have greater cash value. And some women escaped the patriarchy of husbands or fathers. And there's also opportunities that led to greater fear of witchcraft and efforts to restrict female travel and sexuality. Women and peanut production in Gambia. In this photograph from the British colony of Gambia in West Africa, women are threshing peanuts, separating the nuts from the plants on which they grow. And throughout the colonial era, peanuts were the colony's major export crop, and women were heavily involved in their production. So using information from this image, explain how women's lives changed yet remained the same during 19th century colonization. Well, as the image shows, women were involved in cultivation in pre-colonial period. However, the arrival of Europeans and changing market and labor patterns meant that women often became virtually independent heads of household in their husband's absence, taking on more of the tasks of cultivation and often growing cash crops like peanuts, as shown here. Assessing colonial development. So the overall economic impact of colonial rule meant that there were some defenders, and it jump-started modern growth, and there were critics. A long record of exploitation and limited, uneven growth. The colonial rule did help integrate Asian and African economies into a global exchange network, and it did introduce some modernizing elements. The administrative and bureaucratic structures in some areas, communication and transportation infrastructure, especially in major cities, schools, healthcare, and colonial rule did not lead to breakthroughs to modern industrial societies, however. And that concludes our study of ways of working comparing colonial economies. I'll see you guys next time.